We were created for love. We can feel it with every fiber of our being. But all too often our search for love leaves us feeling alone with a more intense awareness of our need for real love. Our efforts leave us damaged and our wake filled with the wrecked remains of too many family members. It's time to experience true love. It's time to experience the Father's embrace.
Now, I want to read you a testimony because one of the questions I have, and I do try to get here early and chat a few minutes with as many people as possible, and we have the same questions all over and over and over again, because so much of my teaching sounds like, you know, I have all these dramatic encounters in God, and I've had a few of these dramatic encounters, but what about the people that don't have the dramatic encounters? What about, much like Hamish's testimony the other night, that he's never really had this dramatic encounter? And we did a pastors and ministers conference in Poland in June in 1999, and there was several hundred that came from all over Poland, but there was one particular young man, and I don't want to share his name, couldn't pronounce it even if I tried, but but he is a very well-known artist, painter in Poland, and also a worship leader there. And I want to share you his testimony about his life being changed, though he didn't have any emotional encounter whatsoever. And I share this in many places, but I'm really tickled by it. And he wrote to me about a year following this conference, and he said, "Being a man of hard character, I did not know how to treat my soft little girl. I couldn't understand either why my perfect example and perfect DNA didn't bear fruit in her that would satisfy me. God was forming my character. I could see changes and growth in my life, and more the bad things were falling off from me, but it was frustrating for me that in relationship with my daughter, there was always a steady regress. Finally, I realized that I was the only one always shouting at her. There was not a single area of her life, in my opinion, that she would deal or act properly. And because of my disappointment and anger, I could not see things reasonably in her. Some of my friends told me that I had a cute daughter, and I thought, oh, if you only knew the truth about her. Yes, there were good days. There was promises of improvement. Occasional hugs or cuddles or smiles. But even the fact that my daughter gave her life to Jesus never brought any change to our relationship. And then my pastor invited me to go to this Jack Frost conference on the Father's love. I believe in miracles just like every respectable Christian, but these American testimonies. So great and spectacular, full of dramatism and heroism. They are like super productions of Hollywood. If not for my pastor's dictate, I wouldn't have gone at all to that conference. On my way to the hotel after the first meeting, I had no doubt that what I heard from Jack, in spite of his dramatism and heroism, he was profound and sincere. Later on, when I heard a passage of Jack's daughter's essay on how he had changed, I asked God and myself, what needs to happen so that I could experience something similar with my daughter? Because I miss this so much. In the meetings that week, I was subjected to the treatment with humility, first penetration of the childhood land, then confessing my sins, then forgiving the guilty parties, and finally those hugs. Yet I didn't experience anything special. Maybe it was because of my hard character. Maybe it was my lack of faith. As I left the conference, I hoped that summer vacations later would bring changes between my daughter and I, but I didn't see anything happen. Months were passing by, and by all appearances, nothing was happening. But one day I noticed that my daughter was pretty. And then another time I was impressed by her sense of humor. So after all, something is changing. I cannot say what the impact of those events taking place at the conference in Wrocław was. God knows. But mostly I remember Jack's daughter's essay, the most true and trustworthy testimony of changing Jack's heart into the Father's heart. I'm aware of the fact that I'm at the beginning of my journey. My almost 18-year-old daughter has just been born again anew to me in my eyes. So I still have time for the essay. But apart from time, I now have faith, hope, and love. And recently, for my 40th birthday, I received a prophecy that God was putting in me the Father's heart. You see, it's not always this dramatic encounter that you may be seeing someone else have. I see that there's two types of encounters people have. Some of us are cliff divers. Cliff divers are like those guys down in Acapulco, and they just dive head first. They're a little crazy. We've just hurt so much we don't have anything left. But others are what I call waders, W-A-D-E-R. They just stand by the beach and slowly wait for the tide to rise. They don't have the deep, dramatic encounters. That's predominantly how my wife has moved into this. We're kind of picking up where we left off, so those that were here this morning, you will miss the first half of the parable of the prodigal father. But we'll give just a very short review that we saw this morning in the parable of the prodigal, that it is in Luke 15, beginning at verse 11. We saw that verse 11 says that a certain man had two sons. And there was truth to this situation, but there's another son that was not really mentioned in this. It's really a story of three sons. Because there was the son who lived in the center of his father's love, never one moment strayed for it. It's the son telling the story. The son who manifested the father's love everywhere he went. And then there was the other son, the son that was a slave to sin, from Romans 6. And this son had prodigal issues. And we saw this morning that this son valued the father for what the father could do for him. And when he had a relationship with the father based upon more for what the father could do for him than for intimacy and love, it caused in his life drift off center of the father's love. Father never stopped loving him. Father never stopped searching for him. Father never stopped reaching out to him. He loved him with a perfect love, and when the son came to an end of himself, he ended up coming home to the father, and we didn't find the father giving him a lecture. We found the father gently, with compassion and empathy, restoring him to this love. But the son, who's a slave to love, that's telling the story, didn't stop. By helping us understand who the Heavenly Father was, didn't stop by talking about the son that was a slave to sin. The son that was a slave to love told a story about another son. He picks up, after the party begins, beginning to tell a story about the son that's a slave to law. And see, you're going to fit into one or more of those three places. There's three positions in life. A slave to sin, a slave to law, or a slave to love. Love is better. I've spent my life as an adventurer, the nations of the earth, from the mountains of Tibet, the jungles of Africa, the Amazon River, captaining fishing boats. I've caught sharks up to 15 feet long. I've caught thousands of them. I've caught grouper, hook and line, up to 400 pounds. My life has been the life of an adventure. I've seen 70-mile-an-hour winds and 40-foot boats with 30-foot seas. It was fun. You want to go? I'm planning a trip to Antarctica. I can't wait. I want to be on every continent of the earth. I want to sail a sailboat down there. I'm crazy. Do you know that? But the greatest adventure at all, there's no greater adventure than when I came in contact with the true meaning of love 6 years ago. And the greatest adventure of my life is living to receive love and give it to my family. And I tried to find love in all the places of the world, and I couldn't find it, but it's nothing like going home on Sunday and the little meaningless, senseless acts that nobody knows about of love that I express to my wife and children. That is the meaning of life. That is what you were created for. That's the greatest adventure you'll ever embark on. John 17:6. Father, I manifested your name among men. A carrier of the Father's love. And you're either a carrier of the Father's love, dwelling in the center, or you will gravitate to being a slave to sin, or you will gravitate to being a slave to law. I've been a slave to sin. I've been a slave to law. Love is better. I like things that scare me. Love scares me. It gives me an adrenal rush, and I'm not talking about just something in a marital bed. I'm talking about living my life to meet another person's needs at my own expense. That's what Jesus died for, so you could be restored in the Father's love. Now let's look at this other son. Are you ready? Will you love me afterwards? Is it going to be all right? You may not. AJ's laughing. She knows. Verse 22. The father said to his slaves, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, fully restored to inheritance and sonship for the prodigal. That's where we left off. And bring the fatted calf, kill it, and let us eat and be married. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again, and he was lost. This doesn't mean he was lost going to hell. In Greek, this means he was marred and wounded by sin, and has been found, and they began to be married. Now, his older son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things might be. And the servant said to the older brother, your brother has come. Your father's killed the fatted calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But the older brother became angry. He wasn't willing to go in, and his father came out and began entreating him. Now look at that. He wasn't willing to enter into the house of love. And so many people, so many godly Christians live their life toiling away in the fields, and they think they're in the Father's house. We'll see tonight. And the son answered the father and said to his father, look, for so many years I've been serving you, your version may, for so many years I've been slaving in the fields for you. The son willing to become a slave to the law. And I've never neglected a command of yours, and yet you've never given me, you see, the hard attitude of the older brother is very similar to that of the younger. The younger valued the father for what he could do for him, gimme, but the older has the same hard attitude. It's just manifested in a different way. You've never given me a kid that I might be married with my friends, but when this son of yours came, do you see what the good son? The good son doesn't claim relationship or kinship with people that don't think like them, act like them, talk like them. But when this son of yours came, he's devoured your wealth with harlots, and you killed the fatted calf for him. Oh, I love this. Look at the way Father responds to him. Boy, if it would have been my son, I'll tell you how I responded to him. But not Dad. Not Abba. Father says, my child. Now, you have to read through the line. You have to read through the Greek. My child. In Greek, that means... He told me before we started, please don't sit in my lap. Now, the older brother's responding with all this rage and anger, and what's Dad do? He says, "My affectionate child." Do you see what a prodigal father we have? I mean, we're raging at him, and he's saying, "Can I hug you?" What is the matter with you? We know what we deserve from him, and we can't even provoke him. All he wants to do is just love on us and love on us. He's a prodigal father, so reckless and extravagant with his love. "My child, I am always with you, and all I have is yours. You have it any time you want. The whole kingdom of love is yours. You can receive love and walk through it any time you want. Provision, health, everything is yours in Father's house. But not if you live out in the field toiling away, mad and argumentative, because you think others are more blessed than you." We need to realize this is the good son. This is the son all of us want. Because all the neighbors look at him and think, "Oh, what a wonderful son. I just wish my son was like that. He's constantly out there toiling in the fields. He never fails to obey his dad. He never fails to keep a command of his. Look at, man, always turns his homework in on time. He makes straight A's. You know, he's captain of every baseball, football team he's on. Man, I've been over to their house, and the son's got a private toilet, and there's not any yellow stains on it. I mean, you just wouldn't believe it. And there wasn't any underwear on the floor. I mean, I can't. His bed was made when he got out of he even got up and took the trash out before Mom and Dad got out of bed, and they didn't even have to ask him. This is the good son. But good for all the wrong reasons. His obedience was not a heart response of love. Because of his service to the Father, his obedience to Father was based upon his love relationship. He would have had his Father's heart. Now, before you get too bent out of shape for having a son that may have strayed away from the home, that may have rebelled against you, this was a perfect father who both sons completely missed his heart. Both sons lived outside of the house of love. And see, this son was good for all the wrong reasons, because his obedience was based upon a fear of failure, a fear of rejection in his father's eyes. And you could see it in his attitude when he felt like the father was blessing his brother more than him. This son's obedience wasn't based upon a heart response of love. It too was based upon a desire. I'm going to serve for personal gain. His whole act of service was, what do I get out of this? And serving for self-gain ends up producing a fear of rejection, a fear of failure, and we begin to drift off center of the Father's love. Serving for self-gain leaves us with a fear of man, a fear of what people can do to withhold blessing for us and not from us. In Isaiah 51:12-13, when you fear man, you draw away, you drift away from the living God. And see, one son, he valued the Father for what he could do for him. He drifted to immoral issues, addiction issues, but the other son, he valued the Father for what he could do for him. It was a dishonor to the Father, and he drifted towards aggressive striving, trying to earn the Father's blessing and approval, and thinking somehow through his hyper-service, his hyper-religious activity, his act right, talk right, do right, if he could be a Dudley do-right, he might earn himself into the kingdom of God, earn himself into the blessings that Father had for him. He completely missed his Father's heart. And see, the whole issue was drift and not discerning his drift. 1982, I'm up off the outer banks of North Carolina, captain of my 44-foot commercial boat, and I'm 28 miles offshore of Ocracoke, North Carolina, right out in 800 foot of water, and I found a whole new strata, a new area of fishing grounds in that area, and in 4 days, loaded down 10,000, 50 pounds of grouper on a boat that would hold 8,000 pounds of fish. But when you're in a bite of fish and you're pulling 50 to 55-pound grouper as fast as you can get down in 800 foot of water, 2 at a time on hook and line, and you get in, I mean, you're just going to keep going. You don't know when to stop. That's when boats sink. And it was slick, calm, no sea on whatsoever. The back of my boat's weighed down, and the stern of the boat's on the back of the water. And I said, I think we better stop putting fish in the boat, and we better get this boat home because it's completely unstable. Any sea on a 5 or 6 foot would have capsized that vessel with that many fish on there. And I said, let's head this boat towards Morehead City, towards the dock. And we put it on our southwesterly heading, turned the autopilot on, which would hold a course dead center, straight on the course on the compass you headed, but it didn't allow for drift. At that time, the electronics on the fishing boats weren't tied into computer systems, and you had to come and check your drift. What's the tide or the current doing? What's the wind doing? Check your Loran position, your navigational equipment that told you exactly where you're at. But we had 4,000 pounds of fish back on the deck in the sun, and I just had to get these fish put away. We had to get them because I got so concerned with the harvest, I didn't take time to discern my drift. And I put the boat in gear. I should have been running about 6.5 knots, that loaded down, but the stern, the rear end of the boat pressed way down the bow. We had lost our ability to make headway at a very quick pace. And I'm heading the boat this way. And for an hour and a half, I went back, and I'm helping the other 2 crew members take care of all the fish, get them cleaned up, get them iced down. And after an hour and a half, I run up to the wheelhouse to check my drift. Well, right after we'd taken off and got underway and started heading for Morehead City, it was very calm. I'm back taking care of the fish, but I saw a tide rip come across the bow. And offshore, a tide rip, especially when we were so close to the Gulf Stream, a tide rip on one side of that little ripple, and it'll be a little 2 or 3 foot ripple. There won't be any current or tide, and on the other side, there's tide and current. And usually the current is on the east side, of course, the offshore side of that tide rip. And I saw it come across the bow, but I was too busy with what I was tied up in. And I tend to be a little task-oriented. And when I'm task-oriented, don't bother me. I don't have time for anything but getting this task done. Now, there's only 1 or 2 of us in the room like that. And so I put my mind to getting what I know I needed to get done, which was more important than anything right now. Get these fish iced. My boat's headed to the southwest. Hour and a half passed. I should have made about 9 miles to the 62 miles back to Morehead City. I go back into the wheelhouse of the boat. I look at my Loran system, and I'm actually about 6 miles north of the spot we started from. Bermuda Triangle. Where are you guys at? That was my first thought, because I've had many of my friends in boats disappear at sea. And so I turned the Loran system off, navigational equipment off, and I turned it back on. It came back up. No, you're about 5 miles north of where you started. I can't be 5 miles north. My boat's heading this way. And then I remembered the tide rip. I pulled the boat back into neutral to check the drift. As soon as I pulled it in the neutral, the Loran system just started, the numbers every 50 feet, clicking just quickly. And I'm just flying to the north with all this current. I was in a freak current that was running so fast. My boat was heading this way, but I was actually going in the other direction. Do you realize when you don't discern your drift, you're about to hurt somebody? And one moment you can come into renewal meetings and just be in the presence of the Father's love and just God just taking your heart and changing you and transforming you. And then the next minute, you've completely misrepresented the Father's love to another person. And every time you drift off center of the Father's love, you're about to commit the greatest sin of all short of unbelief in Jesus Christ. A sin against love. Is there any greater sin than a misrepresentation of the kingdom of love to another human being? And see, because I was so busy with the harvest, I was so busy trying to get what seemed so important to me right then, I didn't take time to check what direction my craft was heading. And because I thought I was doing all the right things, I thought all my equipment was heading this way, and I've got my prayer life down, I've got my word life down, I've got the truth down, I've got my church attendance, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and I've got everything in its place. Oh, I'm okay, you're not. You're about to hurt somebody. And see, that was this older brother. He was so busy trying to do everything he could possibly do to please the Father so he could get some type of reward in return. He wasn't concerned about the basic need of another person for love, acceptance, and forgiveness. He was more concerned with the task at hand. He was more concerned with obedience than he was relationship. And when you're more concerned with obedience than relationship, you will major on justice and truth, but you'll be empty of love and compassion. You'll major on righteousness, and your rightness will begin to justify your negative attitudes towards others, and you'll develop a demeaning attitude towards people who do not think like you do. And see, majoring on truth, empty of love. From 1980, when I was born again, to 1995, I majored on truth. I majored on my discipline. I majored on doing all the right things we heard on Tuesday night. But see, I was empty of what the kingdom of God was all about. I was empty of what Jesus died for. For God so loved the world. And we've learned all this week, all of creation is about receiving love and giving it away. And you'll either be a slave to sin, the prodigal, drifting off center of the Father's love, or you'll be a slave to law, the older brother, or you'll live a slave to love. And once us good sons that do all the right things, once we drift away from a life of perfect love and compassion and forgiveness, you're about to hurt somebody. You see, today boats have early warning systems. They have so many electronics within the navigational equipment. As soon as you drift 50 feet off course, you've got little lights that go off. And if you get over a mile off course, you've got alarms that go off. Back in our day, we had those alarms on the bilges down in the engine room where you had through-hull fittings. You had shafts that went out that connected to the propeller that went out of the boat, and sometimes the shaft couplings would break, and in the middle of the night you would begin to fill up with water. Or you had through-hull fittings that would go into the water. That was the saltwater cooling systems of engines, and electrolysis would eat the fittings away. And in the middle of the night while you're sleeping, just these 1.5-inch pipes would just break off, and in a matter of an hour the boat's sunk and gone. I've had several of my friends that boats sank right out from under them because they didn't have their early warning system. I make sure I had mine. It was a little float switch down in the bottom of the boat, and as soon as water's coming in, float switch rises so far, and then all of a sudden, ah! Scared you, didn't it? Well, you ought to be on a boat 60 miles from land at 2 in the morning, and all of a sudden, ah! You find every person there fighting for their life, and I mean getting down there, and I found my boat full of water several times. Now, how would you like to have an early warning system in your life like that? That as soon as you begin to drift off center of Father's love, something in your life starts going. I kind of think about it as, the robot in Lost in Space? And everything's going along quite smooth, and they're just out traveling around a planet somewhere, he and little Will, are just kind of traveling. And all of a sudden the robot goes, warning, 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 warning. Now, how many would receive something like that in their life, that every time they're about to drift off center of love, something in their life started doing that? Warning! How would you like to have that? Would you receive it? Would you honor it? You already have it. It's your wife. It's your husband. It's your children. We've got early warning systems all around us. Just look in their eyes, and you'll know when you've sinned against love. And so many of your vessels are sinking. So many Christians think vessels are going down, and the alarm has been going, for years. How have you lived with that? And God's given us early warning systems in our relationships all over, and we've not received them. You need to realize the people you live with are the very ones who reveal the uncrucified areas of your life the most. They're the early warning system, the gift of God to your life, that help you find out when you're drifting off center of Father's love. And see, the prodigal son or the older brother thought he was doing all the right things. He was so faithful. He was so dutiful. He was so conscientious. He was so respected by the community. He was so good, but he didn't take stock. He didn't take note in his early warning system. And so what did it leave him? Slaving in the fields, feeling more like a slave than a son. And there's a big difference between servants and sons. Servants can only bring others to a master. Sons bring others to a loving Father.